Palestine Action is not like any other group that the British government has declared a terrorist organisation so far. Yet the government is putting them into the same category as Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. And this sets an incredibly dangerous precedent that impacts on numerous peaceful campaigning groups. There's a long and noble tradition of the use of direct action by protest movements that includes the suffragettes, and yesterday we celebrated the anniversary of the Equal Franchise Act, when women were finally given the right to vote. Also the anti-apartheid protests, Greenpeace and peace campaigners like CND and the women of Greenham Common. Under your proposal, would they also be retrospectively branded as terrorists? Why we should be uniting to proscribe the other two groups that the noble Lord has described. But democracies have to defend themselves against politicians choosing censorship as a way of silencing opposition. This proscription order undermines the entire consensus behind our country's anti-terror laws. I would ask the Minister and every noble Lord if they can name another group that they are about to proscribe which has hundreds of thousands of British people following them on social media. If you want Palestine Action to disappear, then stop sending arms to Israel.
First, to be absolutely clear, I support the right of Israel to exist and for Israelis to enjoy full security. I'm also a long-standing supporter of Palestinian rights to self-determination in their own state. I sought advice from the clerk of the Table Office to amend this regret motion so that it prescribed only the two Nazi-like paramilitary groups it lists and not Palestine Action, but was advised that this was not procedurally possible. In 1969-70, I was proud to lead a militant campaign of direct action to disrupt all-white racist South African rugby and cricket tours, and we successfully succeeded in getting them stopped for 2 decades. I would no doubt I would have been stigmatized as a terrorist today rather than vilified, as indeed I was then. That militant action could have been blocked by this motion, as could other anti-apartheid activity, including militant protests to stop Barclays Bank recruiting new students on university campuses, eventually forcing Barclays to withdraw from apartheid South Africa. Remember also that Nelson Mandela himself was labelled a terrorist by the apartheid government, by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, by the United States and other Western governments during much of the Cold War. Suffragettes attacked shop windows, government buildings and political party offices, sometimes using hammers, stones or iron bars. They also set fire to unoccupied buildings such as churches, railway stations, sports pavilions and empty country houses, intending to cause material loss without causing personal injury. Suffragettes cut telegraph and telephone wires to disrupt government and commercial operations. They even hid small homemade bombs inside mailboxes and attempted to bomb Westminster Abbey and Prime Minister David Lloyd George's unoccupied house.
Things can be unlawful but not necessarily terrorism in terms of protest.
Exactly that point.
But can I start with a sense of disappointment? And the disappointment is that the Home Office didn't see fit to give the intelligence assessment behind this, which he says quite rightly cannot be put in public, before the ISC. The committee met this morning and were quite angry at the fact that the government hadn't given this information to the committee before this legislation was put forward. No attempt has been made by the Home Office to do that. So,
invoking the terrorism laws has consequences, and although I don't object to invoking them in relation to any of these three groups, I think we need to understand properly what those consequences are. Consequences of designation for individuals misguided enough to approve, for example, of Palestine Action, are rather more draconian than the explanatory memorandum to this order suggests. That document states, paragraph 5.20, it is a criminal offence for a person to belong to or invite support for a proscribed organisation. It's a criminal offence to arrange a meeting to support a proscribed organisation. My Lords, that is an accurate summary of Section 11, Section 12.1 and Section 12.2 of the Terrorism Act 2000. If you're a member or a promoter of a proscribed organisation, you can face up to 14 years in prison. But since the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act 2019 introduced Section 12(1)(a) to the Terrorism Act 2000, you can also be looking at up to 14 years if you, and I quote, express an opinion or belief that is supportive of a proscribed organisation, without even needing an intention that your listener or listeners should agree. Being reckless about that suffices. So by bringing Palestine Action, for example, within the ambit of the terrorism laws, anyone who is young and foolish enough to say that their heart is in the right place, or that the government should listen to them, is committing a very serious offence for which they could be prosecuted, convicted and imprisoned as a terrorist. It's not their right to protest that is the issue here. It's the right of freedom of speech.
I have deep concerns about prescribing Palestine Action. I do not think that the case has been made. I think this is a dangerous overreaction to populism expressed primarily in the British media.
I support the proscription of the paramilitary and white supremacist IRM, or RIM as I now have to call them, and MMC. To me, they clearly meet the commonly understood definition of terrorism, which is the use of violence that threatens civilian lives. Palestine Action is different. In its bid to disrupt the arms trade, its members commit serious damage to property. In my view, they're not terrorists, they're criminals. Drawing the definition too broadly risks fragmenting the power of that term and our common understanding of what terrorism is. And I also worry about the impact on community cohesion. So what message, mine is a question, what message would my noble friend the Minister send publicly, but including to minority communities here in the UK, who may sincerely see this prescription of Palestine Action at best as a terrible distraction from the true terror we are all witnessing on our TV screens, when instead the government should do everything we can to help bring the hostages home, to seek justice for all victims of war crimes, to meet our duty under the UN Convention to prevent and to punish genocide, and to secure an end to the unlawful occupation of Palestine with a two-state solution and lasting peace.
Firstly, I would like to make the point of why there are so many people across the UK that have joined Palestine Action and about their frustrations, particularly young people. And I think it's important that we must recognise their frustrations in this current time. But direct action at military bases is nothing new, as many noble lords have pointed out. Welsh women marched from Cardiff to Greenham Common, joined by thousands more women along the way. And they didn't just march, they used a range of direct action tactics, including blockading the base and cutting the fence, protesting against nuclear weapons being held at that base. And there is a long history of direct action across the UK that isn't perhaps comfortable, but the actions of Palestine Action are the direct actions of a civil disobedience group, not of a terrorist group.
I end up relativising what constitutes terrorism if we put something like Palestine Action on the same list as the likes of Hamas, ISIS, Hezbollah. It seems to me that it could create a moral equivalence, and it would unintentionally confirm a prejudice in Western activist circles that the likes of the Houthis and Hamas are just sort of some kind of legitimate resistance group, a little bit like those encampments on university campuses. They sort of, everybody thinks, oh, well, they're just kind of like resisting, we're resisting.
Many young people, hundreds of thousands of people show social media support. This is an issue that we are, as the Noble Lord Anderson very powerfully pointed out, potentially criminalising, calling terrorist an enormous number of people who are absolutely in their gut just so horrified about what's happening in Gaza.
My Lords, I grew up in Ireland, where terrorism was a very real and constant presence. Our newspapers were filled every day with what terrorists had done in the north. I lived in the south. And it was just appalling. Kneecapping, murder, bombing. And that, to me, is the definition of terrorism. I believe that there's a big difference between criminal activity, and I would say that I find anyone who commits violence to be absolutely abhorrent. But I see a very, very different thing between committing criminal acts and terrorism acts. And I do not believe that this particular act was an act that could be described as a terrorist act.
I thank the Noble Lord the Minister for his response, and to every Noble Lord who's spoken in the debate, especially those who've been kind about me. This is a regret motion, and I have heard enough regret from various of your lordships to want to test the opinion of the House.